Hi guys, today we're looking at the Consumer Rights Act 2015, and the Consumer Rights Act 2015 is really a consolidation of other acts that have previously gone before this, particularly with the Sales of Goods Act 1979. So this has really updated that legislation. When we look at the legislation, the Consumer Rights Act, specifically relating to goods, it covers a range of different areas, including an introduction, goods. It covers, what statutory rights are there under a goods of contract, what remedies are there if statutory rights under a goods of contract are not actually met. It covers other rules and remedies under goods of contracts, other rules about goods contracts, and can a trader contract out of statutory rights and remedies under a goods contract. Chapter 3 covers the digital content. Chapter 4 focuses on services, and then the other area is chapter 5, which is general and supplementary provisions. And one interesting section that I find most relevant is the unfair terms. And again, what are we talking about here? We're talking about, terms in a contract, but these terms are not actually written. They're actually implied terms imposed upon contracts by legislation that we know has been passed through, the legislative process. So there are various things that we can focus on, and that is really, goods must be of statutory quality. If you buy goods and you buy a pair of shoes or you buy a dress and then bits are flaking off that dress or holes are actually developing in the dress, after you've only worn it once, then it's not really satisfactory quality. And every contract to the supply of goods is to be treated as including a term that the quality of goods is satisfactory. So the quality of goods is satisfactory if they meet the standard that is reasonable person would consider satisfactory, taking account of any description of the goods, the price or other consideration of the goods, and all of the other relevant circumstances. So again, the goods must be of satisfactory quality. Likewise, the goods, must be fit for the purpose for which they were described. This means that what the purpose was. If you are buying a 2.5 meter curtain pole with 3 brackets and it's supposed to hold a certain weight of curtain, and that curtain pole cannot hold that certain weight of curtain, then because it falls down, then it's not actually fit for the purpose from which it was designed. So again, it must be fit for the purpose. And then the other section which is interesting is, the goods must be as described. If you're saying that you're going into Burger King and they're saying it's 100% beef, then it must be 100% beef that you're eating. It can't be horse meat, as we've seen in the newspapers. So again, the goods must be as described. And what we're really talking about here are implied terms within the contract, as I've stated, implied and imposed on the contract by legislation. And again, we need to go back to the previous lesson on terms of terms, and which could be broken down either as a condition or warranty. And we know that if a term is deemed to be a condition, then you can cancel the contract and you can also sue for damages. But if you breach a warranty within a contract, then your only remedy is to seek for damages. So I think those, and this is very, very important in understanding again terms and also relating it back to conditions and warranties. Now, the other area which is interesting within the Consumer Rights Act 2015 is Chapter 5, Part 2 of the unfair terms. And it doesn't mean because you have a contract and you have terms within the contract that anyone can write any terms and that they're going to be perfectly legally binding. Because when we actually look at the Consumer Rights Act, Section 61 under Part 2, contracts and notices covered by this part. This part applies to contracts between a trade and consumer. It doesn't include contract of employment or apprenticeship. A contract to which this part is entitled is part as a consumer contract. And the part applies to notice to the extent that it relates to rights or obligations as between a trader and a consumer, or purports to exclude or restrict a trader's liability to a consumer. This does not include a notice relating to rights, obligations, or liabilities as between an employer or an employee. Even if we look at section 62, then this is the requirement for contract terms and notices to be fair. An unfair term in a consumer contract is not binding on the consumer, as unfair consumer notice is not binding on the consumer. This does not prevent the consumer from relying on the term or notice if the consumer chooses to do so. A term is unfair if, contrary to the requirements of good faith, it causes a significant imbalance in the parties' rights and obligations under the contract to the detriment of the consumer. So whether a term is fair is to be determined taking into account the nature of the subject matter of the contract and by reference to all circumstances existing when a term was agreed and to all the other terms in the contract or any other contract on which it depends. So again, people cannot just write anything that they feel that they want to write regarding terms if it's a condition or warranty, and then it's going to be legally binding if they are breached, because they could be deemed to be unfair and therefore not relevant. Now, when we think about this, we've talked about the Consumer Rights Act and unfair contract terms. And it's clearly stated that this doesn't relate to employment contracts. However, there are other parts that employment contracts, in terms of unfair terms, can relate to the Consumer Rights Act, Unfair Terms Act 1977, and this can be seen in the case of Bryden versus American Express Bank Limited. And the High Court has ruled in this case that contracts of employment are covered by the Unfair Contract Terms Act 1977, and the Unfair Contract Terms Act prevents unreasonable attempts to restrict liability by making the offering clause in contracts unenforceable. So the effect of this decision would be that the employee could potentially rely upon Section 3 of the Act, which would give protection to in 3 situations. 1, a clause in an employment contract entitling an employer not to perform all or any of the employer's contractual obligations would be unenforceable unless it was reasonable. 2, a clause in an employment contract entitling an employer to render contractual performance substantially different from that which was reasonably expected of him would be unenforceable unless it was reasonable. And a clause of employment contract which, when the employer is in breach of contract, excludes or restricts any liability of the employer in respect of the breach unless it is reasonable. Again, we're talking about this case here relying upon terms in employment contracts, and in the Unfair Contract Terms Act within the Consumer Rights Act 2015, we're talking about certain instances in terms of liability, in terms of the terms being unequitably and unfair, given an unequal balance to the end consumer. Then these terms in certain instances will not be deemed to be fair, and therefore if they are breached, then the contract cannot be rescinded because they were unfair contract terms within the contract. So that covers that, and this is very, very, very important.